Next Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern. What's that? Well, that's when the Treasury Secretary and the IRS Commissioner have to fork over 6 years' worth of President Trump's tax returns that the law says they shall furnish if requested. House Democrats escalated the battle and the stakes for the financials by subpoenaing the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, and Paul Rettig. Who's that? The IRS Commissioner. Now, what will this really mean? Is this politics or is this practicality? Longtime Ways and Means Committee member Lloyd Doggett is here, Democrat from Texas. I told you we'd have you back.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, so let's do this Socratically, Congressman, on a Friday night. The subpoena, not a surprise, because they didn't want to comply. But why does this change the calculus instead of just creating more of the same? You ask, they say no, so now you got to go to court. How does this subpoena matter?
Well, the subpoena is another avenue in addition to the statute 6103 for getting these documents. I think that when we don't have compliance next week, that it will be necessary to move to hold both the Treasury Secretary and the IRS Commissioner in contempt. I hope that can be done promptly. We need to move this along. We need to send a clear message that this is just not all talk and smoke and mirrors, but we're serious about getting this information. This is a president, we talk about contempt, of course, a lot, but this is a president who really holds our Constitution in contempt. And unless we push back strongly, we'll see the steady erosion of our democracy.
All right, listen, I hear the rhetoric, especially coming from Mr. Doggett, but your fellow Democrats have not proved as dogged as you have in your suggestion of what they should do. There's a lot of foot dragging over holding Mr. Barr in contempt, and I'm not saying that that's the right path, but these things come with implications, ramifications, repercussions. If you subpoena them, if you hold them in contempt, you create more animus and probably less chance of any accommodation. What's your calculus?
Well, my calculus is that the chief of staff for Mr. Trump said several months ago, never. And I think we should take them at their word.
Mick Mulvaney won't come on the show. I invite him all the time to make his case. He won't take the opportunity, but he said you'll never see them.
Never see them, and Mr. Trump is making it very clear that obstruction is his middle name, that he will lie, he will instruct people not to come, he will do anything he can to keep the facts from coming out. He recognizes that getting knowledge is power. And this is really a power struggle about whether the president can assume all the power or the checks and balances that our founders envisioned to protect our democracy will remain in place.
Now, I've listened to a couple of the different chairs say, we think we can get this done expeditiously. Where does that confidence come from? You just settled, like what, 2 days ago, the Fast and Furious litigation over then AG Holder being subpoenaed by then House committee members. And it was just settled now. What would make this any different?
Well, Chris, you raised the right question, which is, what's the remedy if this abuse continues? We have the possibility of a civil contempt procedure, which is what applied there for the former Attorney General. It takes a long time. I'm not overly optimistic that it will produce a prompt result. But we do have another alternative that you and I have discussed, and that's the idea of inherent contempt, which has been recognized going back into the last century. It hasn't been used recently, but then we haven't had a president like this recently, thankfully, and indeed I don't think we've ever had a president like this who was so abusive of our system and so eager to assume power.
But there's an opportunity in the recalcitrants. This is the biggest test I've seen of checks and balances since I started this about 20 years ago. You guys are being tested, and the mettle of the different institutions, but also the malleability, the ability to find ways to create progress instead of just more conflict. Are you concerned that just going heavy, subpoena, litigation, that you are not seeking maybe the best avenues to compromise that may get you what you want?
Well, I think it's very clear that this administration will not compromise at all about these tax returns. You know, I asked for them 6 times over the past 2 years. We had obstruction and cover-up. Mr. Neal waited until April to make this request. He has asked not once, twice, now 3 times for it. We can't even find out, as he asked back in April, is the president still under audit? Was he ever under audit? We can't even get a basic question like that. I understand what you're saying, that when the president erects a wall and no one can speak and no documents will be provided, any effort we make appears to be confrontational and an overreach. But I think we're to a point that we have no choice. I mean, he tells people to lie, like his former attorney, both of his former attorneys, and now he has a fixer effectively at the Attorney General's office, his former campaign finance director at as the Secretary of Treasury. We have a group here that is colluding to protect the president, and he's willing to tell any lie and obstruct in any way the whole process. So I think inherent contempt, which would involve sending out a summons, essentially like an arrest warrant, but not requiring the officials to come to the floor of the Congress, assigning it to committee to investigate if there's been any justification for not providing the subpoenaed documents or testimony.
Right.
That's what it's going to take. We can't let them run out the clock and run out the clock on the truth.
True, but, and listen, I get the high-minded nature of it, but there's a practicality as well, which you know very well. I do not mean, and with all due deference, you've been doing this a long time, you know much better than I, and I appreciate that fact. What I'm saying is that the more you look, the more you extend, the more you try, the more will be expected. The idea of, well, they did their job, so it doesn't matter what they came up with. We both know that politically, that's a tough sell. But as much of a cudgel as that may be, you got somewhat of a break today with Don McGahn. The president clearly wanted the former White House counsel to say, listen, I don't think he wanted to obstruct justice, and he didn't say that. What do you make of the development?
I'm hopeful about it, and I believe there's some other people in the Trump administration that recognize they have a broader responsibility to the American people. They seem to be a rarity. And I think there's still others of those people that if they face the prospect of significant daily fines or perhaps even incarceration, they're going to decide they don't want to take that risk, and they will tell the truth. And as President Trump said himself, as included in the Mueller report, the facts in that report and that investigation would end his presidency. He said a little more than that, but that was the essence of it. And that's why he's working so hard to prevent us from getting the full truth here.
He also called, the president called the Mueller report the Bible yesterday. And I think that that's going to be a phrasing that he is going to come to regret as we learn more about the context and whether Mr. Mueller.
Indeed.
I heard that the May 15th is no longer the date. If Mr. Mueller does not testify, do you think that there is really any path forward for oversight? If you don't get him on the record in front of the American people saying, here's what I meant with my explanation of obstruction, and he explains it in a way that gives an avenue to Congress, do you think there's anything more to do here?
I think there's more to do with or without him, but I do view his testimony as really essential, especially after we had a month of propagandizing, of misleading comments, of just downright lies about the nature of this coming out of Attorney General Barr for Mr. Trump. So we need to hear from Mr. Mueller. He is not going to be there as a political figure. Hopefully, he'll be able to testify as an employee of the Justice Department, but if not, when he ends his employment. And I think that the questions to him have to be directed strictly to what the law is and his findings, and not attempt to pit him on one side or the other. We don't need him to be on one side or the other. We just need him to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And that will have the effect of really showing what kind of president we have and what he did with reference to obstruction.
What he thought should happen next. That's going to be key for the American people. Congressman,
yes.
Not only is it Friday night, but I appreciate it. I know in this environment, it is tempting to seek safe harbor and have somebody who's just going to nod their head and say, yeah, do more, go after him, go after him. I appreciate you taking the pointed questions and defending your propositions on this show. It matters to my audience, so thank you. And the best this weekend to all the mothers in your life.
Indeed, and thank you for what you're doing every night in getting more information out to the American people about what's at stake here, because it is the future of our country.
Like we say, let's get after it. Take care, Congressman, and thank you.
Thank you.
So,